Now it's working. All right. Good evening and welcome to the Tony Woiak History Festival. Before starting, I have a really fun fact to share with you. Tonight marks the 62nd presentation since 2012.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you. Move closer to the mic.
Hello?
Yes, choke it up.
That's why singers do that. All right, I'm going to repeat that amazing fact. I'm a newbie on the Washburn Heritage Association, and I've been checking out all the numbers. And I discovered that tonight is the 62nd presentation, festival, History Festival presentation. I think we need to give a big hand to the presenters. And the idea that for this festival was suggested by tonight's presenter. And from the beginning, the festival has been sponsored by the Washburn Heritage Association and the Washburn Area Historical Society. Tonight's presentation has been made possible by a grant from the Apostle Island Historic Preservation Conservancy, and thanks to Harvard U for hosting this evening. Due to the abundance of the COVID precautions, we are not serving refreshments tonight. We won't next time either. We ask that you observe Bayfield County recommendations for large groups, wearing masks, and thank you, I see many of you wearing them, I appreciate that, and distancing from those outside your group. If you wish to linger after the presentation, please do so outside. That would be very helpful. Our next presentation will be here on August 10 at 7:30 with John Esposito's presentation on Blood on the Ice, about fishing adventures. Finally, if you have any ideas for future presentations or would like to give a talk yourselves, please contact one of us, one of the board members. So tonight we're delighted to have Bob Mackreth for his 16th presentation to the Tony Woiak History Festival series. This one entitled Around the Island with Chick. But before starting, here are some interesting facts about Bob. You probably know them, but maybe you don't. He retired from the National Park Service after a 32-year career as a park ranger. His assignments took him from Cape Cod on the Atlantic coast, my home, to Sequoia National Park in California, Sierra Nevada, with stops in between at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, Fire Island in New York, and Ohio's Cuyahoga Valley. Bob's final National Park Service position was park historian at Apostle Island National Lakeshore. Bob, you don't remember me, but I went there one time, talked to you at length. I learned a lot, thank you. Which gave him the opportunity.
Hope you had a good day.
Which gave him the opportunity to study the stories of the men and women who lived on remote islands in Lake Superior, lighthouse keepers and their families, pioneer farmers and fishermen, and the Native Americans who came before them. Since his retirement, Bob has continued to study and write about the history of Chequamegon region. He's lived in the area for 30 years now, and he still finds something new about every time he digs into the archives. So he's not planning on stopping soon. I'm sure we'll see him back out here again. But with that said, I introduce Bob Mackreth.
Well, thank you folks all for coming out. This is a topic that's very dear to my heart, is talking about the establishment of the National Lakeshore, being that I did spend my career with the National Park Service, and we have a a saying, if you've worked for the agency long enough, you bleed green. Now, first of all, can everybody hear me okay? Am I in the right position for the microphone here? Sharon? Okay, great. Hi, Sharon, way in the back. Good to see you here.
A little closer.
A little closer, huh? Well, I'm touching it now, see if we got any closer. I'd have to, get formally introduced. Bleeding green. I know everybody's going to ask, hey, what happened to your arm? I didn't bleed green when my bicycle and I had this disagreement with the pavement on Washington Avenue about a month ago, coming down the hill right there by the water tank. You'd think at my advanced age I'd be smart enough to go a little slower, but you know, when you start cranking it out, it's fun until that last moment. The flight through the air really wasn't all that bad, it was just the landing. But in any event, so you hear me okay here now? Well, first of all, I've got some introductory material just to go over before we really get into the meat of the program. And one of the things I want to establish right off the bat is that about 5 years ago, our late friend, John Fultz, did a program on a very similar subject. And I was not able to come and see it because I was booked to give another presentation that same night. It was frustrating. And Carla had asked me to do a presentation on the establishment of the National Lakeshore. I have been doing quite a few lately, overall programs on the establishment of the National Lakeshore 50 years ago last year. And I said, let me just focus in on something a little more specific to Washburn. And I came up with the idea, let's do one on Chick and Sheridan and his role. And then I found out later on that, it's the same one that John did. However, I hope you will find, those of you who went through, who did have a chance to see John's, we're coming at the subject from a different perspective, and perhaps you'll see some differences and perhaps enjoy a fresh look at things. But one thing I want to make very clear is that John was incredibly generous in sharing his research with me, and much of the stuff here are things that I ended up developing with John in discussion. We used to correspond online quite a lot, and I'm just sorry he's not here to see it today. I owe him a great big debt for a lot of the stuff that you'll be hearing this evening. And let me say, this is going to be much more finely focused than most of the talks I've been doing on the 50th anniversary, which is now the 51st anniversary on account of who expected a pandemic to mess things up. Rather than talking about the broad overall strokes of the development of the National Lakeshore idea and the many years of struggle, I'm going to be mostly focusing on one specific day in that whole many decade process. And I'll take some digressions, some diversions here, some side trips as we go along. But like I say, we're going to take a finely focused look with the help of a Washburn icon, Chick Sheridan. Now, for those in the rear, I don't know whether you can see that T-shirt there. That's Chick riding in an open convertible as a grand marshal of a homecoming parade some time ago. And the T-shirt says, "Who the hell is Chick Sheridan?" Well, Chick, his fingerprints are all over the historical writing of this of this town and this region. Chick was a jack of all trades, freelance journalist for most of his career. He was born here in Washburn, lived here in Washburn, died here in Washburn. And during that time, he wrote for just about every outlet, periodical that ever put ink on paper in this neck of the woods. The Ashland Press, the Washburn Times, the Bayfield papers, sent stuff in to the Saturday Evening Post, tried to get published in Life. I don't know, I've never found anything but rejection slips in the files, but that's puts them in good company. But one of the things about Chick that I don't think is nearly well enough acknowledged and appreciated is the role he played in getting the idea of an Apostle Islands National Park into public awareness, and not just through publicity, but actually being on the ground doing the nuts and bolts lobbying and getting a lot of the legwork done that helped the park eventually reach reality. And I hope tonight maybe to start on the process of correcting that a little bit more. So with that, I'm going to get off my soapbox and tell a ghost story. I'm going to take you to one of my favorite places in the National Lakeshore, what might have been the very best day of my career. If you attended my presentation on prohibition in the North Country a few years ago, you might recall this boat here, lying in the sand, falling apart in the dunes, the very southern tip of Outer Island. All that's left is a skeleton, but if you look a little closer, and you might be able to see a bit about what that boat did during its previous lives. It spent some time as a Madeline Island ferry for a while. It's a backup boat for the Russell brothers. When the other boats weren't running, they pulled this one in. They bought it from a fishing family on Lake Michigan who bought it from another fishing family who had to let go of the boat back in 1929 when the Coast Guard said, "Pull over, son." It was a very larger than average fishing boat. Now we know why. When they pulled it over in the Straits of Mackinac, it was carrying 800 cases of Canadian booze. But that's not what we're here to talk about. It's just one of the things you see at that spot. You take a walk around that beautiful, beautiful sandspit, pristine wilderness, and if you keep looking though, you're going to see some other things eventually coming to mind. How the place looked 90 years ago when Chick went out there. And you just take a walk around to the other side of the lagoon, and you just might hear some voices like I did that day. I couldn't quite figure out what I was hearing, and I was straining my eyes, and suddenly I saw a couple of figures up here looking over at me, and as time went by and my eyes cleared, they started firming up in my sight, and before I knew it, they made their way back to 1930. 91 years ago this week, early August 1930. I just said, "Gentlemen, I think I know who you are, but I'm not sure. My name is Bob Mackreth. I'm with the National Park Service, and you are?" And the fellow on the right in the suit was the guy who answered. He said, "My name's Chick Sheridan. You know who I am. It's my friend Bud Coons with me. Bud writes for the Ashland Press, Daily Press. I write for whoever wants to print my articles." "So what you doing out here, guys?" He said, "Well, we're out here with some other friends. We're taking them around. We're showing them around." "Where?" "I don't see them." "Yeah, look a little closer, buddy." "Oh, okay. I'm starting to see them now then. They look a little dressed up for being out on the beach. What do you think? They're some kind of slobs? You always wear a tie." "Well, I'm not sure I know who those folks are." "Well, pay no mind to most of them. That fellow on the left is the one who I'm trying to impress. He's a big shot with the National Park Service. And we want him to take a look at these islands and go back to Washington and help us turn them into a national park." "Okay, all right, you say so." His name's Harlan Kelsey. I'll tell you a little bit more about him a bit later. "Okay, well, you seem to know what you're doing, Mr. Sheridan. Mind if I tag along with you?" He said, "No, not at all. Go right ahead. You know, we're going up to the middle of the island now. We're gonna move up the middle of the island, up to see the logging camp. those logs, they're causing us, me a lot of heartburns, really. Mr. Kelsey doesn't seem to like having them laying here. Oh my God, yeah, you're right, I'm starting to see them now. Is it always like this? Well, it's been that way for quite a while now. The Schrader Company is out here logging, and they're going through the place like Grant went through Richmond. It's a lot of logs, isn't it, Mr. Sheridan? He said, yeah, it sure is. I'm not happy with the way Mr. Kelsey just keeps coming back and taking notes when he looks at these things. Well, let's get going. I want to get up to the middle of the island, get a look at the rest of the woods. Well, that's not much of a path. It's pretty well overgrown. He said, no, we'll take the train. Oh, you're right. I hadn't noticed. There's a logging railroad right up here. I always thought this was just a trail. No, it's great for the railroad. Listen, son, I know this place. Just let me do the guiding, all right? Yes, Mr. Sheridan, that's right. So we rode up, hopped on this handcar right here with the rest of the party, Mr. Kelsey and all the other fellas too. And went up, putted our way up the track. A couple of loggers ran it. And watched around, and there's Chick snapping away the whole time. And these are all, by the way, Mr. Sheridan's pictures or Mr. Kelsey's pictures, every one of them, from that day. I thought it was like around 2006, but somehow I went to a time warp that it was 1930 all over again. I looked and I said, this is some pretty nice scenery here. I got to tell you that much. And all of a sudden, this fellow Kelsey started. She said, it's a logging camp, that's all it is. And they're ruining the place. Well, I could see Mr. Sheridan's face go white, which is a pretty good accomplishment for a ghost. Starting to get white over. But we went up, and sure enough, I got to look and see exactly what he was talking about. And we got the wrong place here. I just clicked the wrong button. Don't you love these things? Huh? Let's go back. Yeah, okay, let's see. There we go. Forgive me. My ghost is making problems. Power of light. But we'll get to the center of the island very soon. Yeah. We got derailed. Yeah, putting our way up. Yeah, same guy, still working, sawing that log. Yeah, Beaver Pond's still there. All righty. Let's take a closer look at this logging camp now. That's what I really want to be doing. Yeah. There's some big trees that they done cut. And then, okay. So I want you to look at this for a moment. You know what that is? I said, I think I do. I think I do. It's been, Sheridan said, it's been sitting here by the side of the trail for the last 65 years waiting for someone to recognize what it was. If you know what it was, tell me the rest of the story, and then I'll tell you if you're correct. Well, that was one heck of a challenge. I mean, there I am, park ranger. I think I was fairly well experienced, knowledgeable in the history of the park, but I'm talking to one of the guys who actually made the park happen all those years ago, and he's looking at me, trying to make sure that I know what I'm talking about. And he said, well, all right, let's see. And I jumped all over. I went from one era to another, but I tried to make sense. And I said, okay, let me go back a few years. And I think I know what you were doing out here right now. You're taking that gentleman, Mr. Kelsey, around, right? You said so. Yeah. And I said, if I recall correctly, you took a boat out there that belonged to a fellow on Madeline Island. He said, yeah, what's his name? I said, well, his name is Mr. Gary, H.L. Gary. And he says to me, how do you make his money? And I said, well, He's a high, Mr. Gary is at the cutting edge of the telephone industry. He's wiring the whole country for telephones, and he takes his money and he buys himself a nice place on Madeline Island, and he gets himself the nicest boat in this end of the lake, and he made it available to you guys, right? And she said, yeah. He says, as a matter of fact, this is what I learned, Bud wrote about that boat. He said, to describe the yacht Lamora would defy the typewriter of any newspaper correspondent, but nevertheless, there's going to be an attempt made here and now. 96 feet in length and powered by two 200 horsepower diesel engines, the Lamora is one of the finest pleasure crafts to be found any place on the Great Lakes. A crew of 6 men operates the ship, including a radio operator, making it possible to communicate anywhere in the world. A huge living room with an electric piano and luxurious divans and chairs is situated in the center of the ship. Forward of that is the dining room, where 13 can be seated comfortably. The appointments of each of these rooms is perfect, making one feel that he's in a luxurious suite rather than on a ship. The silver in the dining room is all monogrammed with a Lamora insignia. Now, maybe some of you guys and gals out there in the audience here own a boat or have owned a boat, you know, say a hole in the lake where you pour money in. I'll bet you, I don't know anybody ever in my life who has monogrammed silverware on it for his boat. Yeah, we're talking a whole different level there. So the rear of the ship is an observation deck, while below are staterooms, crew quarters, and galley. Staterooms are fitted in perfect harmony with the remainder of the ship, and each has its own private bath. The huge engines, the throb of which can only be heard while in the engine room itself, drive the ship along at a tremendous rate of speed. Mr. Gary said that the ship can be fueled and stocked with provisions sufficient to cruise 1,000 miles with 10 people aboard. Well, that at least impressed Mr. Kelsey, but he commented to the reporter, "It's one of the finest trips I have been on in my life." But let's step back just a moment and find out a little bit more about this Mr. Kelsey. He was a consultant with the National Park Service at the time. He was not an actual National Park Service employee or official. He was a fellow who was very well known in conservation circles in the country at the time, primarily as a horticulturist, botanist, and landscape architect. And he got himself a profitable gig doing consulting work for the National Park Service. And when I say profitable, they paid him $1 a month.
Oh.
And $6 a day for per diem for travel expenses. So, you know, he was raking in the coin. But he came to the islands at the direction of the Park Service director, a gentleman named Horace Albright, with an assignment to look over the islands and report back as to whether they would make a suitable national park. Well, this raised all sorts of excitement in the community because there had been quite a bit of agitation at the time trying to bring about the idea of an Apostle Islands National Park. Now, dropping back just a little bit, Mr. Sheridan said it was okay, just, you know, if they were writing for my publications, they'd make it tell us in order, but I'll let you buy on this. I said, well, best that I can recall, the very first time that anyone suggested turning these islands into a national park was about 1896, 97, something like that. There was editor of the Ashland Daily Press made a suggestion. It's quite a while ago. I would say, yeah, correct. Any things since then? I said, well, in 1909, the another paper came up and said, yeah, Sheridan, you should make a national park out of these islands. And then there wasn't much at all again until the 1920s. And who was responsible for that? I said, well, Mr. Sheridan, I think you were, or I'd say you had an awful lot to do with that. He said, yeah. And then he started talking finally. And he said, yeah, you know, I got an assignment to write about the Indian pageant up in Bayfield. This was 24, about 6 years ago. I enjoyed seeing all the history, and I was very impressed by the number of tourists who came up. And I said, you know, really, we ought to do something to encourage people to come up and get an education about the area and enjoyment and recreation at the same time. It could do wonders for our economy. The mills are all closing, aren't they, son? I said, yeah, they certainly are. We need to find some other way of making money up here. Now, you're certainly right about that. I said, well, I was pushing for it for quite a while. I wrote a booklet on the history of the islands. Actually, it was a series of articles I did for the Superior Telegram, and everybody liked it so much I had them printed and bound, and understand they go for a pretty penny in the collectible market these days. I said, yeah, you know, I've seen one. It's in the museum right here in Orangeburg. A lot of your stuff is there in the museum. He said, I'll have to get over there sometime, I guess. So they made an arrangement, and they got a hold of Congressman Peavy, and one thing led to another, and next thing you know, you've got a committee of movers and shakers, some of the biggest shots in the whole Chequamegon Bay region, getting together and seeing what they could do to push and prod the National Park Service into recommending this to Congress as a national park. One thing led to another, and the associate director of the National Park Service, number 2 man in the agency, gets a hold of this fellow Kelsey and says, would you go and take a look at this place? I'm getting a congressman bugging me about it, and I don't think it's going to amount to a hill of beans, but we need to take a look at it. And those, ladies and gentlemen, were his exact words. He says, I don't think it will amount to a hill of beans. So National Park Man here is coming up with a rather jaundiced eye, but he's done his best to keep an open mind as he looks around. Now, I see a National Park Man, and I'm sorry, I think he might be some sort of superhero in the Marvel universe or something. It's National Park Man. Well, who is National Park Man again? His name is Harlan Kelsey, horticulturist, landscape architect, conservationist. It's a biography of him written a few years ago that came out. Now, just as an aside, I will buy any book that's related to the history of the islands or the area up here. If there's any connection, I'll probably get it. Susan can attest to what our bookshelves look like. I drew the line at this one. I didn't think I needed to read 300 pages about this gentleman, especially when the author said, well, he's sort of like the East Coast answer to John Muir. Ooh. Now, if there is a Hall of Fame for overstatement, that was a first-year inductee, as far as I'm concerned. You know, Harlan Kelsey was a bright guy, and he was, in fact, instrumental in creation of a couple of National Park Service areas back east, including Great Smoky Mountains National Park and Salem Maritime National Historic Site in Massachusetts. But putting him out there with John Muir, I think, sir, Mr. Biographer, you're stretching it just a tad. But nonetheless, he was a respected voice, and he came here, and people were going to listen to what he had to say. So, of course, they really laid it on thick. Gave him, the key to the city, the whole 9 yards. He comes in, he gets to Duluth. He's got several assignments, actually, for the Park Service to look over, because he's supposed to look over a couple of other potential national parks in this area. He had a long, wearying trip. But finally, he's done with the other two parks up in the northern Minnesota. And Chick Sheridan and a couple of the other folks on the committee drive in, pick him up, and drive him back to Bayfield where he stayed. And on the way, they took him up to the top of Fire Tower Hill, they showed him around, and then the next day comes the great cruise. And off we go, we're back, out on the boat, out on the lake, on the great Preston National Park guide tour. And one of the first stops they go to is Oak Island. They pass to the south of it, on the inside of it. And Mr. Kelsey is not all that impressed because he can see that it's pretty well logged over. This is a photo Kelsey himself took. You see the photos coming through here that are in black and white. They are either taken by Harlan Kelsey or by Chick Sheridan. Some of them have the initials down in the lower right-hand corner, like HPK there, being just one of Kelsey's photos, and the others will have Chick Sheridan's a lot of them. Mr. Kelsey, and you'll see, put them all together in an album and submitted them with a report, and that's still there on file in the National Archives. And a good friend of mine who's doing his PhD dissertation on the National Lakeshore copied them all and sent me his scans as well. This whole thing is an effort, a joint effort with lots of friends. But they took a look at Oak Island, and Kelsey noticed that there was this rotting, falling down, what he called a bunkhouse. It might have been. It's southeast corner Oak Island by the sand spit there, if you ever get out there. It's got layers and layers and layers of history. When Sheridan and Kelsey and the rest of the gang were out there, there was a hermit living in one of the abandoned logging camp buildings. A friendly old guy named Martin Kane. They don't call him a hermit really, but he really was. He wasn't the sort of hermit like the one 100 years before on Hermit Island who didn't like having anybody around it and run you off with a shotgun. Martin Kane loved having visitors, especially if you brought anything liquid refreshment-wise along with you. So I don't think they stopped and saw Mr. Kane there in that abandoned bunkhouse. Before it was a logging camp, before it was a hermit's home, 100 years before that, in the 1840s, it was the homestead. It's about the same place anyway, for one of the first white settlers in the area. This was 1840s, before the Treaty of La Pointe actually legally opened up the area to white settlement. A fella named Benjamin Armstrong had a homestead on that spot, and we know that Chick knew about that because in this booklet that he wrote, the articles he wrote about the history, he had an article about Benjamin Armstrong. An Armstrong Indian interpreter, colorful islands figure. And Mr. Armstrong certainly was a colorful figure, and an important one in the history of this region as well. He had this little farmstead out in the middle of absolutely nowhere on Oak Island, one of the very few white people living in the area at that time in the 1840s, and he learned the Ojibwe language inside and out. He was fluent in Ojibwe, and he served as the interpreter for the Ojibwe tribe at the negotiations for the Treaty of 1854, which opened up the area and established the reservations that we know today. But the most interesting thing to me about Benjamin Armstrong is his friendship with Chief Buffalo of the Ojibwe, and what they did, the two of them, Armstrong and Buffalo. When word came around in the 1840s that there were some politicians in Minnesota looking hungrily at these islands and thinking the whole area really ought to be cleared of all of the Indians. Let's get them removed and send them out to the prairies. There's no reason that the Ojibwe up here can't live next to the Sioux in the prairies here in Minnesota, and we can trade with them too. Well, when that word started getting up here, it caused a lot of heartburn. So Armstrong and 90-year-old Chief Buffalo, give or take a few years, he was very old, got in a canoe with about a half-dozen strong young men and paddled to the other end of the lake, made their way down through Lake Michigan, grabbed a steamboat, made it to Buffalo on the Erie Canal, made their way up the canal to the Hudson River, another steamboat down to Manhattan, grabbed another steamboat, and went all the way to Washington, D.C. This hick from northern Wisconsin and this 90-year-old Indian chief went to Washington and demanded to speak to the president. And you know what? Within 2 days of getting there, they were in the Oval Office. Because just by luck, they ran into a congressman who was a good friend of President Fillmore. He said, once Armstrong explained that there was going to be a war because of these Greedy Sons of Gun in Minnesota, he said, I'll get you in. And sure enough, 2 days later, Chief Buffalo and President Millard Fillmore are smoking a peace pipe in the White House together. So, if all else fails, go straight to Washington and demand to speak to the president. Well, I think Chick might have had some sort of recollection of that, because just a few years before the day I saw him out there, he made a trip to Washington himself. Him and his friend there, Bud Coons, who we saw on the beach, they got in their old jalopy and drove to Washington, D.C. to work with Congressman Peary, you'll remember from last program, to see about getting an Apostle Islands National Park bill through the House of Representatives. And sure enough, as they say, they got in this car, these two young men, and they drove. And I really don't know why they chose to drive. I mean, it's not like they had the interstates and cruise control and Sirius XM radio with them. What they did was they took a route called the Lincoln Highway, which had just opened up. And sort of along the lines of US 40 right now, but it's not just, it wasn't the predecessor to the interstates. It was a predecessor to the numbered routes. It was before there was US 1 and US 2. This was the first attempt at a real transcontinental highway. And Chick Sheridan and Bud Coons got themselves on it and drove to Washington to see about getting this national park going. And being that they were newspapermen, they had the enthusiastic cooperation of their editors, especially at the Ashland Press, who published article after article. They did kind of a travelogue along the way. I guess they emailed in their dispatches, telegraphed them, and they made it to Waukesha the first night. And the next day, the paper reports, they made it to Fort Wayne, Indiana. And a couple days later, Bud Coons set down his recollections of a longer description of this trip that he took. We can't help but think, as we speed over this level, monotonous land of the Middle West, what craving the people who live here in the center of the nation's population must have for something wild, rugged, and fast. For these people alone, the Apostle Islands Park project should and will be put across. Well, one of the biggest kicks, though, that we get out of this trip was making our way through the Allegheny Mountains, a ridge which blocked our path out of Pennsylvania. Miles and miles of hills, 30 times as long and sometimes as steep as the hill at White River, Ashland's premier hill. We have just ordered new brake linings for our car, which so far has not lacked a minute under the strain of fast driving. And we blame the mountains for this. Miles and miles of just hanging on to keep from tearing through a fence and toppling into and over several thousand feet. I remember the first time I reported for work at Sequoia National Park and driving up the General's Highway into into the Sierra. I had a very similar feeling, Mr. Sheridan, believe me. And Mrs. Ranger there, Ranger Susan, can certainly agree on that. Okay, well, they made it on late on the fourth day after 1,300 miles of driving. And they never got lost because, as Bud Coons wrote, our chief indoor sports thus far have been reading and pondering over road maps. Anybody remember road maps? Yeah. I sure do. We have about 40 road maps scattered around the car. We keep them tucked near the front seat every minute, and in each town we start to figure out the difference and the distance to the next. I couldn't GPS it, I guess. I sometimes wonder if my grandkids will ever even bother using a road map. Well, they get to Washington, D.C., and first thing they do is they play tourist. I mean, after all this work, who can blame them? They check out the Lincoln Memorial. They think that's great. They get to the tomb of the unknown soldier. And Sheridan commented on the ceremony, but the thing that they really impressed them the most was the Spirit of St. Louis, which was already in the Smithsonian Institution. I just think Lindbergh's flight was only 3 years before. That really made their day to see Lindbergh's plane, and they wrote several paragraphs about the excitement of seeing Lindy's plane. But after that, it was time to get to work. Now, the congressman made plans, worked very hard hand in hand with his office assistant, sometimes called the secretary, sometimes called chief of staff, and referred to by Chick many years later as his office girl, which I don't think she would have cared for, Elizabeth Hawks. Lady from right here in Washburn. One of Wisconsin's first woman lawyers, one of Wisconsin's first female DAs, go on and on a list. Elizabeth Hawks. It's a dissertation in need of writing, really. But in any event, Peavy and Hawks and Coons and Sheridan worked their butts off for the next several days getting ready for the hearing. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is something I think is worth knowing than anything else. Because Chick and Bud, they weren't, if you read the histories, they say they wrote articles, they publicized it. They didn't just write articles, they did the legislative staff work for the congressman. They got numbers, they got facts and figures, they got pictures, they got stories, they got background information, anything the congressman needed, Chick and Bud found a way to dig it out somewhere. And if Liz Hawks needed to help them get their way through somewhere, she was there for it too. Something I think that is totally underappreciated is the role of these two guys in particular, going well beyond what you would normally expect of a journalist. They were very much involved in the nitty-gritty of getting this bill prepared and onto the floor. Well, some really good news a couple days later. Telegram, Coons, and Sheridan, back to their editors, bill passed. Well, yes, bill passed the House, but it never got to the Senate. But really, that wasn't a problem, because all this bill was an appropriation for studying the park. They were kind of, the folks up here were confident if you just get the Park Service people here to look at it, the rest will fall into place. So, the fact that this study bill passed was good. It never got to the Senate, but it turned out Park Service came up with money anyway. Director Albright, again, was very interested in getting a park in the Midwest. He had the idea also, Director of the Park Service, Horace Albright, wanted a park in the Midwest. And he was thinking primarily about Isle Royal, maybe, up the other side of the lake, but he found money to study this Apostle Islands business too. So, all's well so far. And that now brings us back to the lake again, when we're out there touring the islands in Mr. Gary's yacht. Daily Press, enthusiastically, how they stopped at Devil's Island and they got off at the very same place that President Coolidge had lunch just 3 years before. Truly, remember, got to keep that straight. But anyway, just a couple years before that, President Coolidge, spending the summer at what he called the Summer White House on the Brule, a couple hours to the west of here in those days. And they took a day trip out on the islands, again in Mr. Gary's luxurious yacht, his small one that he traded in. It's only maybe 60, 70 feet. He traded it in, and that was a Nellwood. Now he's got the little more bigger one. But it was good enough for the president at the time, and they set up a nice big feed out on the rock there, and you can still get out there. You can't tie up anymore because the cleats are no longer there. They came out a winter ago, and the park never got around to replace it, which I think is a shame. But in any event, the party got off. They looked around and they got an idea of what it was like for the president. And when John Chappell, editor of the Daily Press, went back and wrote his article, he was along on the trip with Coons' boss. He said, President Coolidge will not be the last president to come here. I guarantee you that. Well, in fact, John F. Kennedy did, but he didn't have lunch there at least. Anyway, so they take a look at Devil's Island. They take a walk up this tramway here, up a stairway there, which is actually a tramway. There's a winch, a steam-powered winch in that little brick building up at the top where they have a motor which pulls supplies up. After you unload them down there, pulls them up there. It doubles as a staircase. And then they all walked up the tracks to get a good look at the lighthouse. And lighthouse keeper Hans Christensen greeted them, showed them around. I'm sure, knowing Hans Christensen, he probably bent their ears as long as they permitted him to about his service on a cruiser in the Spanish-American War, because it was a pretty interesting story. They were lost, nearly lost in a typhoon. All their engines went out, and this ship drifted around powerless in the Pacific for more than a week before another ship noticed them. No radios in those days. So that was lighthouse keeper Christensen, and he would tell that story to just about anyone who came by. After Devil's Island, they finally got back on the boat and admired the scenery, the sea caves and the rock formations. And what we're seeing here, am I right, Mr. Sheridan? Well, you tell me. Let me hear what you think that is. I said, those are postcards. It's a postcard you bought and you gave to Mr. Kelsey, right? He said, yeah, I bought about a dozen of them. I understand he put them all in with his report. I said, yeah, I've seen them. And they're all pretty good. And that's one of them right there, straight from the National Archives. Straight from Chick Sheridan by way of the National Archives, actually. Next stop, Hermit Island, where Mr. Kelsey titled this, or rather captioned it, Abandoned and Rotting Home on Hermit or Wilson Island. That, by the way, again, this is Kelsey's actual report. This is how he put it together. I get, I'm looking at it, it's not very professional or polished. And I said, well, for $1 a month, what do you expect? But yes, he put them in a photo album with low corners, and he wrote on with white ink, and his handwriting is almost as bad as mine. So, but this abandoned and rotting house that he saw, I'm sure that somewhere along the line, Chick Sheridan filled him in on the real history of that house, because Chick wrote an article. One of his articles in that pamphlet of his was about Hermit Island and the people who lived there. And in fact, that rotting house was once a millionaire's mansion, a fellow named Frederick Prentice. If you go to Ashland, see Prentice Avenue, Prentice Park, the Prentice Brownstone Quarry here in Washburn. That was his island getaway place. There's a legend that says he built it for a teenage bride who went out there. They spent one night. She said, I hate this place and I'm never going to come back here. And they never spent more than one night in the place. I don't believe it. It's one of those stories that you'll hear, and I think it was made up somewhere as a bit of a romantic tale. If you go back to the actual history, Prentice was one of these rich guys who goes broke, gets a loan, goes to get solvent. You hear about guys who do that. Prentice was one of them. He went bankrupt, had to sell all of his property on Hermit Island a couple of years later, except he went to court and made sure had the boundaries redrawn so he could hang on to this house. If his wife hated it that much, why would he do that? I think the fact is that he did marry, it's true, that he did marry this very young lady, his third wife. Now what she saw in this elderly millionaire, I don't have a clue, but he did fine for himself. They ended up in New York with a mansion on the Hudson River. He died in '93. If she was thinking that she'd be able to, cash in when the old goat kicked off, she had a long wait. So, I'm sure Chick filled the party and that as well, because they say he knew that stuff inside and out. And that pretty much ended their boat cruise that day. But Mr. Kelsey still had quite a lot on his plate. The very next day, they went up in a plane. John Chappell, publisher of the Ashland Press, arranged to have chartered a plane, take them around the islands. And have a photo there of the plane and Mr. Chappell himself. I have to qualify this by saying I am not a big fan of John C. Chappell, the publisher at that time. I won't go into detail. I could go on for hours about some of his positions, but just as an example, he spent a lot of time, several terms, in the Assembly. He wasn't just a publisher; he was a politician, and he several terms in the Assembly. And one of the causes that he worked very tirelessly on was preventing women's suffrage. In 1917, when the measure finally looked like it was going to get through, legislature was going to pass a measure putting votes for women as a referendum on the overall state ballot next year, basically giving men the vote to see should women vote or not. But it was still a step ahead, and in fact, when the vote finally took place, it was overwhelmingly accepted. What did John Chappell do? He could see that the measure was likely to pass the Assembly, so he snuck in an amendment at the last minute that delayed it for 2 years. He couldn't prevent women from getting the vote, but he could make it that much harder for them. So that's an example of the kind of stands that Mr. Chappell took that I don't particularly care for, but sort of proof that the world is not black and white, and there's good and bad and everyone. He was a very strong advocate of the creation of the Apostle Islands National Park, and they say he arranged for Kelsey to go up in the air, and he tagged along as well as one of his photographers rather. He didn't invite Sheridan along, but we'll just have to imagine what it must have looked like, because Chappell wrote on a little tablet on his knee as they were flying over. He talks about flying over, seeing the Ordock, looking off in the distance to the Kakagan sloughs, looking at thin strip, Long Island and the open lake being beyond, looking at the islands and the hills of Washburn beyond that, passing York Island that looks like a boot. Never really thought about that until I got this particular view of it. Passing over Bayfield. Probably didn't look quite like that in those days, but there are some buildings there that still stand. And when it was all done, Kelsey finally had a chance to take a breath. He'd been running flat out for a couple of weeks now. And he still had a couple more days left on his program here in the Apostles, but they had a banquet, or rather an informal meal in his hotel up at Bayfield, and a bunch of the committee members went in with him and sat in and had dinner with him. One of whom was Mr. Chappell, the editor, and he always had his pencil and paper with him, and asked him, "What do you think? How you feel about this national park business?" Mr. Kelsey, according to the notes that Mr. Chappell took, basically said, "Pour a little here." It's hard to turn pages when you only have use of one thumb. You have much in your favor here. These islands must be preserved, and it would be a crime not to have them as a national park, or a national monument, or a national forest, or national game preserve. I cannot tell you just what my report is going to Washington is going to say, because I still don't know for sure myself, but it doesn't seem possible that something like this should fail. You must keep working on this project until some action is taken. I don't understand why it's taking you as long as it has to get national recognition for these islands. Well, that's a pretty strong positive endorsement, and I think everybody was pretty darn pleased. Looks like we've got it in the bag. He likes what he's seen. Well, that takes us back to Outer Island, where I'm standing there talking with Chick and Bud and all the other fellas hanging around and looking down at this kind of wizard's hat thing made out of wire mesh. And he says, "All right, Sonny, I think you're so smart. What is this?" I looked around at my other friends and nobody knew, and I said, "It's always good to have a railroad nerd around. That's a spark arrestor from a locomotive smokestack." Chick said, "You're right, son. Absolutely. It's been waiting here by the trail 65 years. It's about darn time somebody understood what it is." I said, "Well, yeah, you know, in those days with those wood-burning locomotives, they threw sparks right and left and set the woods ablaze. And if you're logging this island, that's the last thing you want to have happen. That's a spark arrestor from a locomotive smokestack, or my name is Bob." Well, it's not just a locomotive smokestack, it's the smokestack off of this locomotive that Harlan Kelsey took a photo of then, because there was this logging railroad out there on Outer Island with two locomotives. And there, if you see, looking at the photo I took and the photo that Harlan Kelsey took 66 years before I was out there, you can see that's it. That's a piece of the locomotive that was still sitting there. Now, I thought that was pretty neat myself, but I could see Harlan Kelsey in the background. He's still kind of shady in the background, but I could make him out shaking his head and scowling. He said, "This place is absolutely crisscrossed with logging railroads. It doesn't look park-like to me in the slightest. As a matter of fact, it looks like it's been completely devastated. And these folks have logged lower half of the island, and if they keep on going, they'll finish the job in another 5 or 6 years, and this place will be nothing more than a disaster area." And when he got back to Washington, these are the pictures he showed the National Park Service director, and these are the comments he wrote. "At the railroad in the primeval forest, ready for next year's operation at Outer Island. Unless stopped, 6 years will see the entire destruction of this marvelous woodland. What fire and the axe have done to Outer Island. Even the soil is consumed in many spots on Outer Island. All merchantable timber is cut and slashed, left to feed forest fires. Something tells me somebody did something nasty in his cornflakes that morning." Well, he wrapped up the trip, and he said, told folks, "Well, I'll be about 6 weeks. I'll have my report, and I'll send it to Washington, and they'll let you know how it turns out." Well, 6 weeks turned into 12 weeks, turned into 18 weeks, and Kelsey wasn't really in a hurry to get the report out, I guess, because it wasn't until January that he finally issued his report. In the meantime, Chick didn't let the grass grow under his feet. He continued to send information, photos, some more of those postcards to Kelsey. he brought Senator La Follette out there onto the island. Chick was a busy fella, and he knew we're on the cusp of something big happening. Report. On January 20th, 1931, he writes, "What must have been a much more striking and characteristic landscape of dark, coniferous original forest has been obliterated by the axe and fire. The ecological conditions have been so violently disturbed that probably never could they be more than remotely reproduced. This, unfortunately, is almost a universal aspect of the islands themselves. As you see from the water, the virgin forests have been ruthlessly exterminated. It would probably take 50 to 100 years to reproduce, even in a measure, the wonderful oak and evergreen groves and restore the vigorous charm and beauty of a mature primeval forest. The ecological conditions have been so violently disturbed that probably never could they be more than remotely reproduced. The second growth on the islands, which I visited, is now in the jungle stage, making it difficult to walk over them and even to follow the abandoned logging roads that I traversed. The hand of man," he ends, "the hand of man has mercifully and in a measure irrevocably destroyed their virgin beauty, and therefore any element making them eligible to a national park status." Why don't you tell us what you really think? Chelsea, whoa, that was pretty darn strong. So what happened? There on Thursday night, he's telling everybody these are beautiful islands and it's got to be something, and the next day, he's writing down notes that lead to this. I can only speculate that it was what he saw that day, that one last day, that basically changed his opinion 180 degrees. So that little piece of a locomotive there has a major piece of Apostle Island's history wrapped up in it, but not one that you would have wanted to happen. It's basically part of that great big logging operation that delayed the creation of Apostle Islands National Park, Lakeshore, whatever, for 40 full years. They were out there in 1930. It wasn't until 1970 that the National Lakeshore was finally created. And of course, they didn't let it go. This is Arno Kammerer, Deputy Director of the National Park. Congressman Peavy pulled twisted some arms, I suspect, and he got a second look at the place from the Park Service. The same guy who said, "I don't think it's worthy of, amount to a hill of beans," he was the one who came and took a second look, and not surprisingly, he said, "No, might make a good state park or something." Well, that idea at least stuck with Chick. But Chick, later on, pushed for that. And I don't want to come down too hard on Director Kammerer or the National Park Service hierarchy at that point, because the idea of a national park in those days was somewhat different than the way we look at it today. National parks, now, there's about 400 units, roughly. Every time I blink, there's another one in the national park system. In those days, there were just about 3 dozen. And they were the ones that everybody knows: Yellowstone, Yosemite, Sequoia, Grand Canyon, the famous ones, Mount Rainier, Glacier. A couple of oddballs, Hot Springs in Arkansas, Acadia in Maine. But by and large, they were all out west, they were all big, they were all glamorous, and here's the thing: they were the best, the biggest, highest, the tallest, the oldest, whatever. There was something superlative about them. National Park has to have something that nobody else has. It has to be the top in some category or other. Batting average, slugging average, pitching, KOs, whatever. It's got to be number 1. We don't accept number 2. No matter how great he is, that's not National Park based. Give it to the state. Well, that began to change just about this time. And that, I think, is one of the many achievements that this Sheridan/Coon/Chapel group did, was they were right on the very cutting edge of that change in thinking. At that time, as John Chapel Road in the National Daily Press. Closest national park to here is almost 1,000 miles away in South Dakota. There's nothing to the east of here except for Acadia in Maine, and that was because of Mr. Rockefeller actually buying it and handing it over to the Park Service. So these guys were really thinking outside the box. And I think those of us in the modern National Park Service don't stop to really give them credit for that, because we are used to treating every unit in the National Park System the same. Whether I worked at Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area, and they turned around a few years ago and changed the title, the congressman there got to change to National Park, it wouldn't have affected me in the slightest. They would still have been doing the exact same job, and the visitors would have had the same experience. It's basically a name change, almost no practical difference whether this is National Park, National Recreation Area, National Seashore, National Lakeshore. Well, now we accept the idea that maybe we can have more than just one. We don't always have to have the superlatives. And that was one of the other things that got in the way at this time. Because the Park Service is also looking at another Lake Superior place, Isle Royal. And the idea was, well, we can have one or the other, but there's certainly no sense in having two island parks in Lake Superior. Isle Royal got not. We can debate who should have won that first heat. Now just put this in your mind. They're both wonderful resources. When I worked at Apostle Islands for all those years, we would get roughly about 200,000 visitors a year. It's not like when I worked at Cape Cod, which was 8 million a year, but it's respectable for a middle-sized park. 200,000 visitors a year at Apostle Islands. Isle Royal in a typical year gets about 7,000. 2017, the most recent year that I could find figures, about 220,000 visitors to Apostles, less than 7,000 to Isle Royal. It's a little harder to get to. Whether or not the resources any more exciting, spectacular, available, I don't know, but Apostle Islands certainly makes more of a recreational opportunity for a larger number of people. And again, things start to change just at that time, and this group was part of that effort, even though it kind of, misfired the first time around. A couple years later, they established Everglades National Park, which is the very first national park that was created with the idea of preserving an ecosystem. There's nothing spectacular in the Everglades, it's just the overall Everglades ecosystem. And that was a whole new concept. First national seashore came along in 1940 at Cape Hatteras, and National Lakeshore has come along later. In 1970, of course, we had the national park. But in the meantime, for the short period, and Chick was involved in this too, getting Apostle Islands State Park established. Gaylord Nelson was a big part of that. He managed to get 3 of the islands designated as a state park. And of course, when the national park came along, they were absorbed into the national lake shore. But in, of course, 1970, we get the creation of Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. And Chick was still around then. He was born in 1905, passed away in 1991. So he was around to see this happen, and to see Gaylord Nelson being lionized in all of the history books as the father of the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. And I tell you something, I was quite happy to say that myself as well. Until John Foltz, our friend here, shared the fruits of his research with me. And John, had gone to the National Archives and gone through the Kelsey report and all of that records from this particular trip, and generously, incredibly generously shared it with me. Some of the photos I have here came from John Foltz, some of them came from my friend Jim Feldman, who wrote his dissertation on this, and some of them are right here in the museum here in Washburn. And you haven't been over there recently, get over there. There's a lot going on in the museum there. But John, I'm sorry you couldn't be here tonight, but you helped make this possible, buddy. So thank you. Now, we still haven't really solved that one nagging question. who really is the father of the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore? Well, these days, you have ways of finding out. And I don't know the answer either. I'm going to open the envelope now. Gaylord Nelson, you are the father!
Yes.
And John Foltz, Chick Sheridan, you are one of the grandfathers. I'm not expecting that at all. They don't look at all alike. But I think that's fair to say. There's no way on earth that the National Lakeshore would have happened without Gaylord Nelson's unmatched political savvy and energy and his ability to play the congressional game as an highest level. But again, Chick Sheridan, Bud Coons, John Chappell, and a number of others were ones who laid the groundwork for Nelson to make it, get it home. So, one last sports metaphor for the night. You've got your starting pitchers, you've got your setup men, you got your closer. The closer makes a lot of money and gets an awful lot of credit, an awful lot of blame if it goes down. Every one of those has an impact on the game. Gaylord Nelson closed it out. No question in my mind that those other fellows in the 1920s and 30s basically got them through the opener and the middle innings. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I am done for the evening, and I strongly again urge that you go over to the museum and take a look at Chick's very cameras that are there on display, and it's so much more that relate to this and so many rest of what's going on here in Washburn over the last century and a half. Thank you very much for coming out. I've gone on long enough. Questions, I'll be around. I know it's gotten late, and so come to see me at the up here if you have questions.